Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the fourth installment of the week on Kalamkari and allied practices. So after we have discussed the relationship between Kalamkari architecture and other Deccani craft forms, now let us look into Kalamkari and trade networks. Now we have looked into this map earlier, and when we sort of tried to understand this idea of India's relation, or this Indian subcontinent's relationship to the other parts of the world, and then how those trade networks were there. And mostly we are talking about the oceanic networks. Those were there during the early modern period from 17th century onwards, and then of course towards 19th century and so on. So in this time what we see that the importance of some of the ports on the Coromandel coast, so for example Machilipatnam, Nagapatnam and so on, they have become very important, and Machilipatnam especially. So in these cases what we have that Kalamkari textiles which were produced in the Coromandel region, we find them to have audience or patrons both inland as well as in other parts of the world. And so that for that reason what we find that there are distinctive kind of textiles which were made in the same workshop or in the same region, which would probably be the ones which were made for inland trade would have a very different kind of flavor from the ones which are made for outlandish ones, or for the foreign trade, perhaps, if I can specify it in that way. So the kind of textiles which would be sent to Siam or Thailand, and then part of Malaya, or the the port of Malacca and places like that. So in those places we find that particular kind of textiles were preferred, and those kind of textiles were commissioned by the traders from there, and those kind of textiles would be distinctive from the ones which are made for inland trade. The similar thing can be said also about the ones which were intended for use in Middle East or part of Eastern African coast, or then those were taken to the mainland, and so those ones will also be very different. Now with the arrival of the Europeans from the 17th century, we also find that they also had their own kind of their own aesthetic sensibility, at the same time their own demand for for the domestic market there. And that's the reason we find that different kind of experiment had all taken place in this Coromandel region. So the artisans who would be able to do dyeing and drawing and printing, all those things efficiently, they would probably deal with imagery from different parts of the world, perhaps the different kind of cultural aspects which they were not exposed to earlier. So it's a complex situation for artisans who perhaps speak language like Telugu, Tamil and so on, but then they're dealing with material perhaps which are not really from those region or from those cultural context, but still they were able to convey the cultural meanings efficiently, successfully in those textiles. So with those things we also find that, as I have already mentioned, that this kind of trade networks that sort of made room for exchange of knowledge. So for example, we find that the local knowledge would come in contact with the inter-regional knowledge there, and that is how the traders knowledge and perhaps the kind of objects and items that traders would bring to this workshop, and how those objects would perhaps enrich the visual and the vocabulary of the artisans, as well as the intellectual capability of the artisans to think through them and then sort of implement them in their craft practices. So those things we also find that how particular sites on the coast have been very influential, but also at the same time with this kind of exchanges, the nature of this port sites have also changed extensively. So for example, in the right corner we have a so in the right corner we have an image of a warehouse. It's a Dutch warehouse that we find from this area called Bandar Kota, or this port site, a fort site of Machilipatnam, and that is slightly sort of away from the city or the town of Machilipatnam today. And so this is the area in which we find this 17th century Dutch fort was established, and the primary work, or like the primary responsibility of the people who were there in the Dutch fort was about textile trade. And for that reason we definitely see that why this kind of this robust warehouses would be required for storing textiles and perhaps spices and other goods. And so, and this entire area was walled and then like a highly protected, and then there was also a jail around this area. So one can imagine that this kind of textiles, they needed to be kept safe and for their high economic and cultural value. So those kind of things we find that how this trade networks and also like how this cultural exchanges, they paved the way for different kind of interactions which might not happen otherwise. Now with those things in mind, let us look into one of those textiles and try to see that what all were happening if we think that those trade networks, they have enriched the visual vocabulary of these textiles. So this is a rumal, and it's a kalamkari rumal or a coverlet, whatever we call it. And in this one what we see that perhaps there is this elaborate border here we have, and within the border there are many groups, compositional groups, who are gathered around this central architectural motif. And this central architectural motif seems to be a combination of tent, like for example in this cases we see these extensions and so on, and then also it seems like the stories and part of like the pillars and everything else make us think about perhaps there is a stable architecture here as well. So it can be a combination of both. And in this case what happens, we see that around in this architecture, of course there are like motifs we can see, like of like this jars and vessels, and then also like some of the references to like ceramic tiles and all, which shows that perhaps they were drawing this kind of motifs and the architectural this organization from the Deccani palaces. And then what we see there, that this colorful textiles which is coming together with this the palace complex or the stable architecture. So it kind of makes us think about this overlapping between stable and temporary or transient architecture at the center. Then what we see here, there is this princely figure also dressed in perhaps in a this expensive brocade, or perhaps in a kalamkari textile, who knows. And then in this case what we see, this elaborately dressed royal who sits here rested against a bolster, this huge red bolster, and then he is being served wine by this attendant figure, this female attendant that we have. And then there are people who are playing drums, and one is perhaps there is an attendant figure, again a male attendant, so they are guarding this place. Then we also see that different kind of like people around them. So in this group it seems like there is a soldier, and then someone is being attentive to the soldier, and they are almost in this conversation where this person is still tying the sash in his waist and coming to hear this soldier for whatever reason. Perhaps this soldier also carrying some important news, and that's the reason we see that he is holding something in his hand which looks like perhaps a letter or something that needs to be given to this man, and that's the reason this man is hurrying and then like still tying his sash and rushing out to this person. So if this is one of the scenes that we find here, on the other corner we have, there is this man again who's dressed in this Persian turban, and then like also like the facial feature and everything seems that this pale complexion, and then like the kind of jama and everything else that we have here, it seems like a Persianate figure, perhaps also a Deccani royal, who knows. But then this man is met by this person who's perhaps from Eastern Asia, who's wearing this conical hat, and then also has those slanting eyes, and then the beard and everything else which are characteristically Eastern Asian. And then we see this man is wearing something like a small this waistcoat, and at the waist we see that he is tying a piece of fabric, but then in the bottom part of the body he is also wearing this sarong or lungi, which is just this one plain untailored piece of fabric that is wrapped around the body, something that we see in part of South Asia also in Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia. So this distinctively Eastern Asian man, we find this man to be here in conversation with this Persianate figure. So in the same this rumal, we have like different kind of motifs in which we see that different kind of activities are taking place. Perhaps this also gives us a sense of this different kind of overlappings that we are initially talking about, that what the trade networks or this cultural exchanges enabled the artisans to experiment with, that they were perhaps exposed to different kind of people or like images in which they could see that different kind of dressing style and then the facial feature and everything being different from one another, and they have successfully implemented them in this figural groups. And at the same time, the overlapping also comes between like permanent architecture and transient architecture. So those things are also implemented in this central architectural motif that we have here prominently presented in this rumal. So this kind of aspects that make us think that the trade networks or like this cultural this exchanges are not something that had just happened on the superficial level, but the artisans must have absorbed this essence of this kind of exchange or the coexistence of different kind of people in the same region, and then what happens with that. So those kind of things make us think that the extent of this kind of cultural exchange and something which we usually talk about in the context of the traders or the people from the elite class, but this kind of experiment that also tells us that the artisans were very actively, they have very much participated in this kind of cultural exchanges, and that is how this kind of complex imagery came into being. Now if we also compare it to like the other Kalamkari textiles, then we can also imagine that what kind of differences that might have presented there. So in the right side of the screen, we have this elaborate Kalamkari hanging that came from 19th century, perhaps from Madurai, and which is in the southern Coromandel region in Tamil Nadu. And in this one, what we see that there is this Shaiva saint Manikavachar, and then also then we see that scenes from goddess Minakshi getting married to Sundareshwarar, and then so these scenes like all are in the Shaivite theme. We find them to be there in this textile, and this textile also follows this typical arrangement of the temple hangings, except the fact that even in the borders we see that some kind of narration is still continuing. So for example, in the upper border we have the narration continuing, which in many of the other Kalamkari textiles, the temple hangings, we find that usually like the flowers or ornamental motifs are there in the border and not strictly figurative narrations. So in this one, what we again see that there are those horizontal registers in which like the entire hanging is divided, and then we have the figures, and those figures are then associated with text, and sometimes the text would be written in Tamil, but then also surprisingly we find a lot of Telugu text in the Tamil region, like the Tamil speaking region, and that's because a lot of those artisans were Telugu and Telugu speaking, and that is the reason we find that how a lot of those textiles, even though those were made in the southern Coromandel, but were a lot of times like we'll find them to be made by like Telugu speaking artisans. So whatever it is, we see that here there are like text which are associated with like this imagery that sort of tells us about that what image or like what figure we are looking at, what part of the story of Minakshi and Sundareshwarar we are looking at, and so on. And of course there are those iconographic details which help us to sort of read through this narrative or see the entire narrative, how it unfolds. Now if we compare it to a rumal that we have already seen here, so in the earlier slide, in this one we can see the kind of like how the color scheme, at the same time like the way the figures are being drawn, and then the kind of information about the different part of the world, perhaps all those things are brought in, is something that is very different from how this temple hangings were made. So for example, in both cases we find that the initial drawings are done by this column. So for that reason, all the lines, or like all the contour lines of the bodies, they need to be drawn with this column, with this black ink or kasam, whatever we call it. So if this is what is used there, but then we can also see how the way of drawing it is very distinctive. So for example, in this temple hanging, for a valid reason, we find that the figural motifs, they sort of follow the iconography of those different characters, and they also stay close to or faithful to the other figurative representation of these gods and goddesses, those we see in the manuscript as well as in the architecture. So if that is something we find, but then the same artisan perhaps, or artisan from the same region would use the same column, the same ink to draw something like this Eastern Asian man or this Persianate figure, and in which the character of the drawing completely changes. The essence of it, or like the flavor of it, would be very different from how the column is used for making a temple hanging. And it's not just about drawing, but we can also think about the kind of other aspects of these images, in which what kind of backgrounds are used, and then all the other elements which are then incorporated as part of this kind of motifs. So for example, in this motif, if we go back, this particular area in which we find that there are two antelopes or deers which are seated there, and then there is stylized depiction of rock formations. So this is something we find in those shikargah carpets, and then those other textiles which we have already seen in the Persian context. So there are many different kind of references, we find them to be there much more fluidly sort of incorporated in this rumals or in the trade textiles than the ones which were perhaps intended for the temple hangings and the inland trade. And for those reasons, what we see that the artisans had this extensive sort of the vocabulary. At the same time, their skill was expansive, so that they could incorporate different kind of motifs. If required, they can get engaged in making temple hangings, but at the same time they could also get engaged in making things which were not really part of their culture, the regional culture or local culture. So these are the kind of experiences, since there is no written record of the artisans about how they have absorbed the flavor of the cultural exchanges and so on. This textiles, they remain here for us to understand that what kind of cultural exchange they were part of, and how they might have incorporated this different kind of informations and sort of blended them together in the imagery that we see here. The other aspect of the trade exchanges, we see them there, is the use of different kind of particular motifs, and one of the motif we will find them to be there, and that is the pineapple motif. So in this rumal, this Golconda coverlet that we have already seen, so in one part, in this section of the coverlet right here, we have this one motif. There is this ascetic we find that is there seated on this rock formation, and this ascetic, we can see him here with this very characteristic animal skin, perhaps a tiger skin being worn in his body. And then we also see this almost like this yoga patta, that is sort of tying his two knees together. It is also a sign that is used in the yogic poses. We find that to be extensively used in the Deccani and South Indian cultures, and one of the very famous example of that would be the Yoga Narasimha from Hampi, which was previously Lakshmi Narasimha, and then in the 19th century renovation this yoga patta was added, and then it was made as a it was sort of like, transformed into Yoga Narasimha. So a similar kind of Yoga Patta we find that to be there in this ascetics around the knees of this ascetic. So it kind of like confirms that this person is an ascetic, and we see that with the beard and everything else, that it confirms that perhaps this ascetic is someone who's perhaps in his old age. And then this person, we find that he is holding in his one hand this brightly colored pineapple. So what does that mean? We do not really know that if there is any relationship between an ascetic, and perhaps it's a Hindu ascetic because of the Yoga Patta and so on. So there is no direct correlation we find between a pineapple and a Hindu ascetic. But then what we see during this time, that in the 17th century, the Portuguese traders, they have brought pineapple from South America and Central America, and then they have arrived in the coast of Coromandel. And from there we find this pineapple motif was extensively then used in many of the textiles, even in those prayer mats, janamas. We find in the apex of the arch there is usually a flower or like a bud motif. Even there we find the pineapple motif to be incorporated. So this new fruit that came with the Portuguese traders, it was well accepted in the Deccani society, and we have records, the Mughal Wakais and so on, in which we find these fruits were then presented to the rulers, the Golconda rulers, and the Qutub Shahi kings. They were very much fascinated, enthralled by this kind of gifts and this new fruit. And so we find that this kind of fruit then became part of this larger Deccani visual lexicon, and it was not something just utilized in this kalamkari textiles, but in many other visual forms. So for example, we find that how in this particular architectural panel, this comes from the Qutub Shahi tomb complex, tomb of Hayat Bakhsh Begum, and is the northern gateway. And on the top of this gateway we find this one horizontal column which is full of pineapples. And pineapple, then, like, in one hand we see one motif that is there with the Hindu ascetic, and the ascetic is gazing at this pineapple. On the other hand we see this entrance to the tomb of Hayat Bakhsh Begum that has this panel of pineapple on the top of it. So we see that pineapple was in the 17th century. By this time we find that it was already been accepted as something that was related to good health and good fortune. And so those kind of association, which is still there in part of Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and part of that region, so those kind of aspects we find them to be there, also absorbed in the Deccani culture. So this idea of the fruit that is related to good fortune, health and so on, something that perhaps already been developing in part of Southeast Asia. And when the fruit arrived in the Coromandel coast, we find that this fruit was not just something that was accepted as this new wondrous fruit, but it was also something that came with its cultural meaning, which was associated with good health and perhaps good fortune. And that is how it became much more relevant to be incorporated in the Deccani craft forms and architectural forms. So this is the other extent of like this cultural exchanges which were happening, which is not just sort of like focused on the textile, but it also shows that what kind of like cultural exchange was happening in the 17th 18th century. The textiles were part of it, but also the other kind of visual representations and the materials like the architecture, different craft forms and so on were all part of this kind of cultural exchange in Deccan and southern India. Now the other part of like the trade around kalamkari textiles and similar kind of objects we find is that when the European traders they arrived there, they have also demanded that what kind of like flora and fauna that would be drawn on those textiles. And for those reasons we find that after a particular point in time, the European traders they would prefer that motifs of like birds, less of animals, but then more of like those flora and vegetal and creeper motifs. And so those things we find them to be there. So in one hand, like the perhaps like some kind of tailoring requirement were given to the artisans, and the artisans perhaps kept those requirement in mind when they were making those pieces of untailored fabric, and then after making them we find them to be tailored perhaps mostly in Western Europe and made into dresses like this. So with this oceanic trade networks, we find that initially a lot of the European traders were interested in sort of in the barter system, for which they can get the Indian textiles and then sort of exchange them for Southeast Asian spices. But then we find that how those textiles also gained a huge popularity and market in Western Europe. For those reasons, we find that the European traders become increasingly interested in obtaining this dye painted, modern painted textiles, the Kalamkari textiles from the Coromandel coast, and then sort of bringing them to Western Europe, to the market in Western Europe. And this kind of activities that went to certain extent that in the early 18th century there was a ban on importing chintz textile, this Kalamkari textiles, which are also called chintz in Western Europe in the context of Britain. So we find that how these textiles were banned, but then the banning actually did not help. It increased the popularity of these textiles even more, and more of the smuggling that started happening of these textiles, and those textiles were sold for a high price. So in one hand we find there is a stage in which that the textiles, how the textiles have appeared in the market in Western Europe, and only the wealthy people could wear them. And then we see that sometimes that for since the cotton textiles were not really as expensive as the brocade, or like the European the woven cloth and everything else with motifs. So we find that it was not just there with the elites, but then it kind of like also were disseminated in the larger public. And that was kind of like we see that how this globalization of style, something that is coined by Beverly Lemire and then also like Maxine Berg and so on, that started happening with these textiles. So it's not just that how the traders, they brought information to the artisanal workshops in the Coromandel coast, but this kind of textiles, when they arrived in the other parts of the globe, they also transformed the local markets, and then like the regional economy, at the same time style and fashion and everything else with that. So of course, like when we see these textiles, we cannot really just think that this is all about celebrating these cultural exchanges, but we also know that how there have been all those hierarchy, and also like how the money making and everything, they do not really acknowledge the contribution of the artisans. So all these different parts, we see them to be there as part of like the cultural exchanges and trade networks. So from transforming the workshops on the coast to like transforming the market and fashion in other parts of the globe. Thank you.